Good day, I'm Charles Fried and this is Contemporary Deontic Contract Theory. It all began on my contract as promise. My theory constitutes an explicit defense of the claim that contract law provides a ground of legal obligation distinct from any other area of law. I defend the classical view of contract proposed by the will theory. My principal motivation for advancing the distinctiveness thesis is to support my normative claim that contract law is morally justified because it legally enforces the moral obligation to keep promises. Contract law provides a ground of legal obligation. Central conception of contract as promise. Classical view of contract proposed by the will theory and implicit in the assertion that contract offers a distinct and compelling ground of obligation. Contract law is the only body of law devoted exclusively to enforcing promissory obligations, and that is morally justified because it legally enforces the moral obligation to keep promises. Promise principle means that persons may impose on themselves obligations which were non-existent before. I do claim that all and only those cases decided on the basis of the promise principle can qualify as a genuine contract cases. Furthermore, I identify the consideration doctrine with two propositions. The consideration that in law promotes a mere promise into a contractual obligation is something, or the promise of something given in exchange for the promise. The law is not at all interested in the adequacy of the consideration. The goodness of the exchange is for the parties alone to judge. The law is concerned only that there be an exchange. The shift of contract law has not laughed so radically with the winds of political, social, or economic change. The law contract has maintained a steady course along the latitudes of morality. It is the moral force of the concept of promise that has directed the route along which the law has evolved and developed. It is the obligation to keep one's word that has been the rudder. The role of good faith in fair dealing in contract law. These notions ought to reflect not the response of a moral philosopher but the responses and usage of ordinary, right-thinking people, provided that in using the high-tech technique of common law, the closest attention is paid to the purpose of the law of contract. For example, to promote good faith and fair dealing. The aim of any mature system of contract law must be to promote the observance of good faith and fair dealing in the conclusion and performance of contracts. The first imperative of good faith and fair dealing is that contracts ought to be upheld. Applying the theory of Charles Fried on online shopping. The ability to form contracts online has revolutionized the way business is conducted. In the UK, almost all types of contract can be made online. There are very few which the law requires are still made in writing or physical sign by the parties. Contracting online is essentially the same as contracting offline. The same requirements have to be fulfilled in order to ensure that the contract is legally binding. These requirements are fairly basic. There must be an agreed set of terms and both parties must intend to enter into a legally binding agreement. Under Philippine law, there must also be some form of consideration. payment of some kind for the goods or services being provided. UK and US lawyers break down the process of contract formation into three stages: an invitation to treat, an offer, and an acceptance. The distinction between the three stages is not always immediately obvious. When you see an item for sale in a shop window, you may think that the shopkeeper is offering to sell it to you. However, in legal terms, the display of an object is not usually an offer to sell that object. Rather, it is an invitation to treat. An invitation to treat comes before the offer in the contractual process and is an indication by the seller that they may be prepared to enter into a contract. The second stage, the offer, only takes place when you go into the shop and say that you'd like to buy the item in the window. Your statement is an offer to purchase the item. In the normal course, the shopkeeper accepts that offer by taking your money and handing you the item in question. However, the shopkeeper could refuse to sell it to you for any reason whatsoever. The distinction is important. If the item in the window was considered an offer, which the buyer accepts, then the shopkeeper would be bound to the contract as soon as the buyer asks to buy the item. The three-stage analysis is critical to the question of how contracts are formed on the web. It is likely that websites will be treated as being similar to a shop window and that advertisement of an item for sale on a site will amount to an invitation to treat. If so, an offer will only be made when a customer gives notice of his intention to buy an item from the site, at which point the seller will still be free to accept or reject that offer. The significance of this analysis was dramatically illustrated in the UK when an online retailer mistakenly advertised televisions for sale on his site at €299 rather than €299. If the advert was an offer, then the retailer was bound to sell for €299. If the advert was an invitation to treat, the supplier could refuse to accept the offer. Acceptance. With the online business process being automated, there may be confusion as to when an offer is accepted. The basic rule is that for acceptance to be effective, it must be communicated. However, as the law currently stands, it is not clear when an online acceptance is communicated. One point to consider with an automated e-commerce process is the use of an automated receipt of order. Where there are limited number of goods or where a serious pricing error has occurred, an automated acceptance could be disastrous, potentially binding the seller to contracts it cannot fulfill. In order to protect the seller, any automated receipt should make it clear that this is simply a receipt of order and not an acceptance. The receipt should make it clear that the acceptance will follow later. The manner in which the content is formed and the point at which acceptance of order occurring should be made clear in the terms and conditions of sale. Consideration. Under English law, there must be a consideration for a contract to be binding. Each party must obtain a benefit from the contract. In commercial contracts, consideration is rarely an issue. The buyer receives the goods or services and the seller receives the price. But there are rare occasions on which it becomes important. Consideration is not a requirement of Scots law. Incorporation of terms. The terms and conditions on which the parties are contracting must be agreed by both parties and incorporated into the contract between them. Simply placing terms and conditions on a website is not enough to incorporate them into a contract. The parties must agree that they contract on the stated terms, and they must do so before becoming contractually bound. When dealing with customers of a website, the seller must ensure that the ordering process requires the customers to read and agree to the seller's terms and conditions. Best practice to ensure this is to include the terms and conditions as a separate page in the sales process and requiring the customer to acknowledge he has read and agreed them before proceeding to place an order.
Applying the theory of Charles Fried that a promise is enough to bind the parties to comply with their agreement based on moral obligation. In an online shopping absent any written contract duly signed by the parties may be held liable as defiance to the promise to pay and deliver the object of sale is contrary to one's being of morally good as it runs counter to the natural dictates of a human nature.